The fastest way to quietly cripple a portfolio is not to buy something stupid. It is to buy something that looks smart in the wrong account. That is how a lot of people get hurt. Not through obvious recklessness, through respectable mistakes. A 10% yield that feels brilliant until taxes arrive. A high-income ETF that looks like retirement freedom until you realize the distributions are being taxed like ordinary income. A covered call fund that feels safe until you understand you shoved the wrong engine into the wrong vehicle. A forever ETF that might be fine inside a Roth but becomes a drag inside a taxable brokerage because the tax consequences keep leaking value out of the system year after year. I am Warren Buffett, and if there is one thing age teaches you about investing, it is that a good investment in the wrong structure can become a mediocre result, and a mediocre result repeated for decades becomes a very expensive life. That is the deepest value inside the reference document you gave me. On the surface, it is a list of the 5 best ETFs for a taxable brokerage in 2026, with sample portfolio percentages based on age and goal. But underneath that frame, the strongest message is sharper. Taxable brokerage investing is not just retirement investing with a different label. Taxes change the entire logic. Dividends matter differently. Qualified dividends matter more than ordinary payouts. Broad market exposure behaves differently from income products. Growth allocations belong in a different place depending on age and risk. And the best ETF is not best in the abstract. It is best only in relation to your tax situation, your time horizon, your need for cash flow, and the role this account is supposed to play in your life. Fay file a site, Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay. That is how I would tell the story, not as a list. As a correction, because most people think the hard part is choosing the ticker. Very often the hard part is understanding the job. What is this account for? What is this ETF supposed to do here? What tax consequence comes with that job? What kind of return is this thing giving me? And what part of that return gets quietly shaved away because I put the wrong kind of product in the wrong place? That is the kind of question adults ask. The childish investor asks, what yields the most? The adult investor asks, what survives the whole system best after taxes, after time, after volatility, after my own behavior gets involved? That is a much better question. So let us begin where the reference begins, with the single biggest difference between retirement accounts and the taxable brokerage taxes. The file says this clearly in a 401k IRA or Roth IRA. The tax structure gives you either tax deferral or tax-free growth depending on the account type. In a taxable brokerage, by contrast, when you sell appreciated assets, you trigger capital gains. And if the asset produces dividends, you owe taxes on those dividends even when they are automatically reinvested. That means the brokerage account is not just another bucket. It is a bucket where the type of cash flow matters enormously. Fay file a site, Fay turn 31, file 0 Fay. That is the first principle. In a taxable brokerage, friction matters. Not visible friction, only invisible friction, tax friction. A lot of investors obsess over expense ratios while ignoring tax drag. That is like comparing 2 pairs of shoes while your house quietly leaks water through the roof. A few basis points can matter, yes, but if the product itself is creating taxable events in the wrong way year after year, then the structural problem is much bigger than the surface level fee discussion. This is why the file immediately turns to dividends. And it does something important that many YouTube scripts do not. It distinguishes dividends by tax character, not just by size. That is exactly the right move because investors love yield. Yield feels like progress. Yield feels like proof. Yield feels like the portfolio is doing a job for you while you sleep. But the adult question is not simply how much yield am I getting? The adult question is what kind of yield is this? How is it taxed? And is it appropriate in this specific account? The file says this directly. Some dividends are qualified and therefore taxed at a much lower long-term capital gains rate, sometimes even at 0% depending on income. Though often around 15%, other dividends are not qualified and are instead taxed at ordinary income rates, which can be dramatically higher, especially for higher earners, and then potentially even worse once state taxes are added. Fay file site Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay. That is not a small distinction. That is the whole game in many cases. People see 10%. I see after-tax character. People see monthly cash flow. I see whether the IRS gets invited to dinner too often. People see a great income ETF. I ask whether it belongs in a taxable account at all. This is why the file S example of JEPQ is so commercially powerful and so useful. It says JEPQ looks attractive because of its near 10% distribution yield, but much of that payout is taxed as ordinary income, making it far less efficient inside a taxable brokerage, especially for current earners. The conclusion is not that JEPQ is inherently evil. The conclusion is that it is usually better suited for tax-advantaged accounts than for taxable brokerage use. Fayfalicite Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. A lot of the Internet's favorite income ETFs are really context mistakes waiting to happen. People see the distribution rate and stop thinking. That is how expensive mistakes happen. A taxable brokerage is not the place to worship gross yield. It is the place to think hard about after-tax efficiency, control, and the job the account is supposed to do over time. That is why I think the document is wise to move next into what it calls the value or dividend ETF category. Notice the subtlety here. It is not chasing reckless yield. It is looking for qualified dividends, lower volatility, recession-resistant businesses, and a cash flow component that still behaves well enough tax. Wise to belong in a taxable setting that is mature thinking. The file names SCHD, VIM, and VTV here, and it assigns them an important dual role. First, they can provide qualified dividend cash flow and therefore feed a dividend snowball if reinvested. Second, they can bring downside protection and lower volatility compared with pure growth, heavy exposure. Because the types of companies held in these funds tend to be steadier, more mature, and less driven by speculative enthusiasm. Fay file site Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay. That is exactly how I would explain it. The taxable brokerage does not need to be built like a casino. It does not need to be built like a dopamine machine. It needs to be built like a long-lived capital structure. And in that structure, a value or dividend sleeve can serve a real purpose. Not because dividends are magical, because quality, lower, beta, qualified, dividend producing companies can help create a steadier foundation while still respecting the tax environment better than a high-yield ordinary income product. That is an intelligent role. But even inside that category, the file makes another useful distinction. If you want the higher dividend cash flow, it says SCHD is a strong choice. If instead you want to minimize taxes and maybe allow for more price appreciation with less payout, it suggests VTV. That is not just a list difference. It is a role difference, Fayfalicite Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay, that matters, because the right ETF is not best universally. It is best in relation to what you need the allocation to do, and that leads naturally to cash and bonds. This is another place where the file is much better than most surface level ETF content. It does not just say hold some safe stuff. It asks what kind of safe stuff makes tax sense here. That is a serious question. The file says a money market fund can be a fine place to hold cash in a taxable brokerage, though yields will move with rate policy and may decline as the Fed cuts. It then points out that SCHD can be particularly attractive for certain investors because of its treasury bill exposure and the absence of state tax on that interest in many places. It also says traditional bond ETFs are generally poor fits for taxable brokerage accounts because the interest income is usually taxed as ordinary income. Fay file site Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. The word safe is incomplete without the word efficient. Safe, but tax, inefficient can still be costly over time. A taxable brokerage is one place where treasury, bill structures, and cash vehicles deserve more careful thought than generic bond. Fund reflexes, that is maturity. Now we reach the center of the whole portfolio, the foundational ETF. This is the anchor. This is where most of the long-term money-making power lives, and the file treats it with the respect it deserves. It says the broad U.S. stock market, whether through the SP 500 or the total U.S. market, has survived depression, crisis, crashes, bubbles, pandemics, and multiple waves of fear, and still compounded upward over long stretches for those who held on. It gives the dramatic example of $100 invested before the Great Depression growing into a huge sum by 2026 if dividends were reinvested. The exact historical number matters less than the lesson. Foundational market exposure survives what most people emotionally cannot. Phaephilosite Phaeturn31, File 0 Phay, that is one of the oldest truths in investing. The broad market keeps humiliating people who think in short periods and rewarding those who can remain owners through long ones. That is why I agree with the file's treatment of VU and VTI. It says the SP 500 and total U.S. market have been neck and neck for a long time, with VU slightly ahead over some long periods and VTI giving broader exposure to roughly 4,000 companies. It also makes a very practical point that if two ETFs are tracking essentially the same index, then the key tiebreakers are often fee, implementation, and your own preferences rather than some mystical superiority of one ticker over another. Phaephilosite Phaeturn31 File 0 Phay, that is correct. People love to turn tiny structural differences into grand battles because battle feels meaningful. But in truth, a broad, low-cost foundational ETF is not where most long-term investors win or lose by a mile. They win or lose on whether they stay invested, keep contributing, avoid tax stupidity, and avoid turning a sound allocation into a collection of fashionable mistakes. That is the real battle. Now let us leave the United States for a moment. International diversification. This is another category where adults and children think differently. The child wants to know which thing won most recently. The adult asks what role this plays in the whole machine. The file is appropriately restrained here. It recommends broad international diversification through VXUS, but it explicitly says to keep enthusiasm under control because long-term international returns have generally trailed us equities, even if recent 1-year or 3-year bursts have looked excellent. Its case is not international will beat the U.S. Its case is diversification outside the U.S. and exposure to non-US firms and regions as a balancing sleeve. That is exactly right. Phaephilosite Phaeturn31 File 0 Phay, that is the intelligent way to use international. As ballast and breadth, not as a religious statement, not as a recent performance chase, not as a fantasy that the laggard must now inevitably dominate forever. That is not investing. That is storytelling. And storytelling is expensive when it takes over allocation decisions. Then we get to the growth side. This is where many people get emotionally reckless, and the reference file does a good job keeping the discussion grounded. The file divides growth into two layers, broad growth and aggressive growth. That distinction is very important. Broad growth still has a core role. Aggressive growth is optional and should be smaller. That is mature portfolio construction. The broad growth sleeve in the document centers on QQM and mentions SCHD and VUG as alternatives. The logic is that these funds provide exposure to fast-growing large companies, especially technology-heavy ones, while still being broad enough to remain core. Like rather than purely speculative, the document also notes that QQQM offers the NASDAQ 100 exposure at a lower fee than QQQ, and it highlights the strong historical returns of these broad growth products over the last decade or more. Phaephilosite Phaeturn31 File 0 Phay, that is a useful category. Not because recent tech performance guarantees the future, because growth exposure still deserves a place in many taxable portfolios, especially for younger or higher risk investors with long horizons. But the adult move is not just buying growth, it is sizing growth correctly. And that is where the document shines most age and goal. That is the missing variable in most ETF videos. The internet loves universal answers because they are clean and marketable. Life is rarely clean in that way. A 30-year-old trying to build aggressively, a 48-year-old in peak earning years trying to optimize tax drag, and a retiree trying to preserve safety and cash flow should not own the same taxable brokerage in the same proportions. That would be absurd. The file understands this and gives 3 sample portfolio builds for the younger high-risk investor. It uses meaningful allocations to foundational exposure, broad growth, and even some aggressive growth, while still keeping a value sleeve for the middle-aged moderate risk investor. It leans more toward VTV for lower dividend drag and safety, then still uses foundational and growth exposure. For the lower risk near retiree or retiree, it tilts far more heavily toward SCHD and foundational exposure, with only a modest broad growth allocation and nothing in the highest risk category. Fay file a site, Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay, that is exactly right. Portfolio design is biography. The best taxable brokerage is the one that matches your stage, not the one that wins the argument section. The young investor needs compounding, firepower and time leverage. The middle-aged investor often needs tax awareness, high earning, year realism, and balance. The retiree needs stability, cash flow support, and lower fragility. Those are different jobs. So yes, I like the file. S overall architecture. A taxable brokerage can sensibly contain a value or qualified dividend sleeve, a broad S foundation, a modest international sleeve, a broad growth engine, and, if appropriate, a smaller aggressive growth sleeve. That is not an arbitrary list. That is a hierarchy, safety, foundation, diversification, growth, then selective aggression. That is intelligent. Now let us talk about aggressive growth, because this is where mistakes become photogenic. People love the hottest category because it gives them a story to tell. The file handles this section more carefully than many creators do. It defines aggressive growth as narrower, more sector-specific, more volatile, and therefore suitable only as a smaller piece of the portfolio. It uses examples like semiconductors, metals and miners, Bitcoin exposure, and then says its own preference in this category is VGT, which is still concentrated in technology but broader and somewhat more consistent than the more extreme examples. Fay file a site, Fay turn 31 file 0 Fay. That is exactly how aggressive growth should be treated, as seasoning, not as the meal. This is what many investors never learn. A good satellite is not a good core. Something can be exciting, productive, and worthwhile at 10%, while being destructive, destabilizing, or foolish at 50%. That is the difference between investment structure and emotional impulse. And that is why I appreciate that the file does not just shout tickers. It keeps returning to roll size, volatility, and suitability. Now let me pull the entire system together. If you strip away the YouTube wrapping, what is this document really saying? It is saying that a taxable brokerage should be built with tax character in mind. First, it is saying the broad US foundation still matters more than everything else. It is saying high-yield ordinary income products belong in the right account. Not just any account. It is saying qualified dividends matter in taxable ways that many investors ignore. It is saying diversification should exist, but with realistic expectations. It is saying growth deserves a place, but size should match age and goal. It is saying aggressive ideas should remain smaller and more honest. And it is saying that the best ETF question is really a question about account location, tax drag life stage, and the specific role you need each holding to play. That is maturity. Not just buying what looks exciting, not just copying someone else's list, not just chasing yield or last year, best chart. Maturity is asking what this account is for and which products lose the least when the full tax story is finally told. And that is why I think the title should hit harder than the usual best ETFs forever language. Because the real story is not that these are simply the best. The real story is that most people do not realize how easy it is to sabotage a taxable brokerage by importing the wrong ETF logic from retirement accounts or social media yield obsession. That is the danger respectable sabotage. The investor thinks they are being clever. The tax bill thinks otherwise. The investor thinks the big distribution means success. The account location says maybe not. The investor thinks the hot niche ETF is the key. The portfolio structure says only in the right place, at the right size, for the right person. That is what adults understand. And if I had to reduce the entire story to one sentence, I would say this. The best taxable brokerage ETF is never just the one with the best chart, the highest yield, or the most hype. It is the one that still makes sense after taxes, after time, after your age, and after the job of the account are all honestly included. That is the whole game. Not excitement fit, not yield after tax usefulness, not one universal answer. A structure that matches the life you are actually trying to build. And once you understand that, the taxable brokerage stops looking like a random shopping cart of popular ETFs. It starts looking like what it should have been all along. A deliberate machine for long-term tax-aware wealth.